Shalom and welcome to this, our 20th edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. Let's begin with prayer. Heavenly Father, as we learn about the background of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well and the very central parable of the Good Samaritan, prepare us to learn the powerful lessons that Jesus is teaching us about our relationships with others. And we pray this in the name of Jesus who gives us life. Amen. All right, now we're getting ready to do that fourth in the series of unlikely but significant women in Jesus' life and teachings, and that will be the Samaritan woman. But actually, that's going to be the very next lesson. I mentioned last time that I'm going to do a lesson today about the background of the Samaritan woman and also the parable of the Good Samaritan, which will be the following lesson. It'll probably be divided into a couple parts because it's so large and it's so huge and so very significant. So what we're going to look at today is a little bit different. We're going to look at the background of this Samaritan conflict with the Jews. Okay, so let's do that. This is kind of a real general map of New Testament Israel. The area called Judea being the south, Samaria in the center, and Galilee in the north. And we are going to be centering this lesson today, and of the story of the woman at the well is going to be at the town of Sychar, as you can see right in the center, in the region of Samaria. And the question is, why there? Why would that be the location that Jesus is going to choose to meet the Samaritan woman at the well? And as we're going to learn, it's very, very significant he chose that location. Now, this is what it looks like today. It's a pretty heavily populated area. The town today is actually called Nablus. It's a Palestinian-run area. In the Old Testament time period, it was called Shechem. And it is located right between two mountains or two big hills, one on the left called Mount Gerizim, on the right called Mount Ebal. From this direction, we'd be looking directly towards the Mediterranean Sea or directly west. Now, the New Testament is the town Sychar. The name Sychar doesn't actually show up until the New Testament. It's not in the Old Testament, but Sychar is going to be this location. As you can see, it's right next to Shechem, and it's right at the base of Mount Ebal. So, lots of things happen in Shechem, leading to the background of why Jesus chose this location. And that's important to understand all that so that we have this context, this whole idea. What's going on? What's behind all this? So let's look a little closer here. The first Shechem story was when God called Abram to go to Canaan. Okay? And he obeyed. God had made this promise, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now Abram obeyed and set off with his wife Sarai, his father Terah, and his nephew Lot. When they got to Haran, they stopped to settle. Here Abram's father Terah died. By now Abram was 75 years old. God told him to continue on to the land of Canaan. He obeyed, and they traveled south into the land of Canaan to the Canaanites. So from Haran on down to Shechem would be this route right here. When he got to Shechem, God told him, I will give this land to your offspring. So that promise of the land, God was confirming right here at Shechem. Abram built an altar to the Lord at Shechem and worshiped him. He marked the spot linking God's great promise to the land. So this is very, very significant. Now, the second Shechem story involved Abraham, which of course he's later going to be called, his grandson Jacob. So we go from Abraham to Isaac, his son, and then Jacob, his grandson. And Joseph is going to come into play here also, and that's, of course, one of Jacob's sons. Now, this is recorded in Genesis 33 that Jacob, after reconciling with his brother Esau, of course they had a big conflict, returned to Shechem and for 100 pieces of silver bought a plot of land from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, outside the city. If you remember, Sychar was just right outside the city, right on the edge. Jacob also built a memorial altar to recall his grandfather's promise from God. He wanted his offspring to visit the site often, so he also dug a well, and that's no small feat during that time period. Then Jesus came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave his son Joseph. So here's the biblical account. That's where he's going to go. And again, this map right here, just go back to it for a second. You can see Sychar to the right of Shechem. That would be slightly north, right at the base of Mount Ebal. So that would be the location. Okay, and as I mentioned before, in the Old Testament, it's called Shechem. New Testament, Sychar comes into play. Now, this is actually a picture of today, what's left of Shechem in the middle of this larger city today called Nablus. So this would be the ancient city of Shechem, which is right next to Sychar. You can see some of the ruins here. Okay, some of the walls, what's left. It literally right in the center of that much larger town today. And this is from Preserving Bible Times. I've used these videos a lot. It's a short little video just kind of showing you an overview of what's left of Shechem today, the ruins of Shechem.
This unique ground level clip begins with a view of Mount Ebal and turns to the tell, or mound, that are some of the ruins of ancient Shechem. In the foreground is a wall line, and behind it, a rectangular foundation of a temple. We look east toward the Jordan Valley as the camera returns to where it began.
Now, Jacob also dug a well there, and that's not explicitly mentioned in the Old Testament, but of course in the New Testament, John 4 account, it is. And you can see the location. It's a little bit to the left of the ancient Shechem and Sychar. And that would be the location of it today. So let's look at it a little bit closer. Now, to the left, that's actually what it looked like a few years ago. It's inside of a church. But to the right, this is kind of a very ancient drawing, a very old drawing of what it looked like. But on this location, the Samaritan woman was talking. The story we'll get into next time. But she asked the question of Jesus, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" So she is going to hearken back to this, and that will be significant in the story when we look at it next time. But this is a church that's built right over the top of the well. This would be today, of course. So that's what that church looks like. And this is actually the well itself. If you get on the inside and look at it, it looks like this. It's incredibly deep. She mentioned that in the story, that the well was very deep. It's estimated to be over 150 feet. Now, this was dug 3,800 years ago, approximately, and it's truly stunning how Jacob did this, how in the world he could do this. It's really amazing in the ancient world, some of these accomplishments. But what they probably did, and it's hard to understand exactly how they could dig these wells, but they usually would look for trees like willows or cottonwoods or oak trees and certain wildflowers and plants that would be in certain areas that maybe were very dry, and yet there they were growing. So there's an indication that there must be some water beneath. That's kind of the old idea. It sounds like that they would look at, like drainage areas, and you can see the mountain beyond there. And this area by Sychar, if you remember those two hills, was a drainage area. The hills coming down into that valley. And incredibly, they dug these wells with hand-stone tools. It's really quite something. They had to line the inside with field stones as they dug down deeper and deeper. The entrance to the well was kind of raised to protect the impurities from getting in. The wells were covered with a stone to make sure nothing else got in on top. Depending on the depth, the difficulty of digging could take months or even years. And they're incredibly invaluable to them. And they would put these covers on top of the wells, these stone covers. And you can see how the well is kind of raised up here a little bit. Now this one, of course, is overgrown by some vegetation, but this is an ancient well. Similar to what it would have looked like, the Jacob's well, back in those days. Now, the third Shechem story Following the years in the wilderness, Joshua led the Israelites back to this land promised to Abraham many years earlier. Ultimately, this would be a vital part in the role they played in bringing the future Messiah into the world. Remember, taking possession of the land was going to be vital to the covenant promises of God. This is going to be central because this is what God told them to do. So we have Joshua coming in after Moses had died. He took over and they crossed the Jordan, fought Jericho, and he's going to wind up going to Shechem. So that's where Joshua is going to wind up going soon after that battle. So here he is. Joshua is here. He came here to review their history, the obligations to the covenant, okay, from Abraham, and important role they played in the salvation plan God had given to Abraham. So they're in between, they're by these mountains, and something is going to happen in this area that Joshua is going to be doing. He built an altar on Mount Ebal, inscribing the law code into a stone monument and leading the people to declare their commitment. Okay, so that is going to happen up on Mount Ebal. All right. In Deuteronomy 11:29, it says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess," speaking to him, okay, "you are to proclaim the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal." And this is going to be a kind of a form of covenant renewal again. So that's going to happen right here, on these two mountains in this area right here. Now we're going to look at a video from Preserving Bible Times. It gives us a really good overview of what this area looks like. Kind of the center of this is Mount Ebal, looking from their surrounding area.
The helicopter circles the summit of Mount Ebal that was in the western territory given to the tribe of Manasseh. This mountain, over 2,600 feet above sea level, was in the divided kingdom of Israel, and in Jesus' day, the region called Samaria. The Old Testament reports that Joshua built an altar somewhere on this mountain to commemorate Israel's entrance into the land. As the helicopter turns, a large valley and city south of the mountain come into view. To the left, the valley leads down into the Jordan Valley. Mount Gerizim is the hill seen on the other side of the valley. On the slopes of Mount Gerizim are the outskirts of the city of Nablus that occupies the valley floor.
Okay, now another event we're going to be taking a look at here, and this deals with Joseph. And this is Joseph's tomb, just quite near Jacob's well, where it's been found, it's been located. And this is the background to the story. In the bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up out of Egypt, and obviously you remember that whole story of Joseph in Egypt and his brothers, were buried at Shechem in the plot of land that Jacob had purchased from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver. So it became an inheritance for Joseph's descendants. Now, the background to the story of the Samaritans, a little bit deeper, a little bit of history here. So let's do that. Let's go back in time to the tribes. That would have been the time of when Joshua came in. This started from about 1400 to say 1047 roughly, the 12 tribes. The second little segment would be the monarchy, the kings. And then the third would be when Israel become a divided kingdom. So to the left map is the monarchy. And that would be not really a very long time period, just over 100 years. And you can see basically what Israel looked like. It wasn't divided at the time, it was one country. And to the right would be the time after it was divided. It became known as Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Now that term Samaritans is going to come in later. And during this time period, the south had, the Bible lists as basically 8 kings that were good, that did some good things, and there were no kings in the north that were righteous before God. So the north is going to fall first because of their disobedience, which was extreme. Okay, so Samaria was the capital city in that northern kingdom of Israel, which fell first. And that's why this name Samaria, the Samaritans and Samaria in general, is going to be taken from that capital city later. Now, in 875, a king named Omri founded Samaria, this capital city. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria, after Shemer, the name of the former owner of the hill. Okay, now it remained the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel until Assyria destroyed it in 722. And there it is right there. So, with Samaria as capital, the people become later known as Samaritans. And you can see Samaria and Shechem pictured in this picture right here. We're going to take a look at a view from Samaria looking down towards Shechem. They're actually not that far apart. And here it is, Samaria on the right. It's on that hilltop, okay? And it's highly likely it was the wealthiest city in all of the land. It was extremely wealthy. And then Shechem is between those hills down there in that valley. You can see, and it's really not that far apart. So let's look at Samaria for a minute. During the monarchy period, it was run by Omri, and there were other kings in this area. And then see where it says Herodian Temple, that would have been years later during the time of Herod the Great. There was settlements made on that part of this hill. These are some of the ruins of the walls, which were gigantic during the monarchy. It was quite a powerful and wealthy town. And this is going to be an overview. I'm going to show you a couple little videos of this area of Samaria. So this is again from Preserving Bible Times.
The camera flies east to west along the southern side of the ancient ruins of Samaria. In the 9th century BC, the Israelite king Omri purchased and fortified the hill. He named it Samaria, and it was the capital of the northern kingdom until the Assyrians defeated Israel around 720 BC. On a hill rising over 300 feet above the surrounding valleys, it was strategically located near crossroads of major highways. Easily defended, it later became an important Hellenistic and then Roman city. Herod the Great rebuilt the city about the time of Christ and renamed it Sebaste. Excavations have revealed Samaria and Sebaste were wealthy. The bus moving down the hill has just passed between massive round Hellenistic towers built about 300 BC. These towers guarded the western entrance to the city.
Now, Omri, whose name you heard in that video, the king who bought this area, had a son named Ahab, which may sound familiar to you. He had a wife named Jezebel, and Jezebel was pretty famous for her paganism. She was a daughter of the king of Tyre, a Phoenician princess. And she accelerated the worship of Baal and Asherah, which already was in Old Testament Israel, but become on a much greater scale, largely due to her influence, so significant. Bringing this pagan worship into the northern kingdom in particular was going to be devastating to them ultimately. It was almost everywhere. And eventually there's going to be this conflict with the prophet Elijah. And the prophets of Baal and Asherah are going to have this conflict with him in terms of trying to set this altar on fire. I won't go into the details, but Elijah won the confrontation. The altar was set on fire and those prophets were killed. Now, Jesus and his disciples had an incident where they hearkened back, the disciples did, hearken back to this incident with Elijah, okay, concerning the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And here's what the Bible tells us, this description in Luke. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. So this, of course, is later in his ministry. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. No, he's going through Samaria. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. Now, in spite of the warnings of the prophets, in 722, the northern kingdom fell. The city of Samaria fell first, and then the northern kingdom fell. So that happened because of their idolatry worship. As they did throughout the northern kingdom of Israel, they, the Assyrians who conquered them, took many Jews into captivity. They left some Assyrians behind to supervise remaining Jews, to farm the land. This is recorded in 2 Kings 17. They also brought conquered people from other nations and resettled them in Israel. Much of the agricultural produce was brought back to Syria. Over the years of Assyrian occupation, many of the Jews married Assyrians and some of the other settled peoples. This mixed race of people become known as the Samaritans. Now that's beginning to make sense, this great animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. There was a history of Samaria in the time period of Herod the Great when it was rebuilt as a Roman city. And you can see some of the columns there, typical Roman columns in this area. And of course, they always had theaters. So Herod the Great built this part of the city or during that particular time period. He called it Sebaste. And the following video from Preserving Bible Times is going to center kind of on that part of the city.
The helicopter circles over the ruins of Sebaste's ancient forum, built by Herod the Great about 25 BC, and a basilica. The forum is the large area farthest from the red-roofed building, with remains of columns. It is about 425 feet long and 240 feet wide, and originally surrounded by 24 columns. The forum was the central market area, used for commerce, courts, and public discourse. The basilica is at the end of the forum, nearest the red-roofed building. The clip ends with a close look at the remains of the basilica and a semicircular niche and benches in the nave.
Now, as I mentioned, in 721, the Assyrians came in and just conquered Israel, and the captives were taken back to Assyria. The ones that they left, typically in that ancient world, were the lower class. They took the wealthier people back, middle class, back to the conquering kingdom, in this case, Assyria. So that's what happened. And they left some of those people, as I mentioned, to farm in Israel. And of course, there was much intermarrying that happened. This relief found in Nineveh, Assyria, shows how brutal it was. Many of these captives were impaled, actually. It was absolutely horrific. That was a result of their idolatry in the northern kingdom. Now, the king of Assyria brought back many other people from Babylon area also. And some of these are listed. So it wasn't just Assyrians, it was people from other conquering kingdoms that they had conquered. That they wanted to really mix the races up so that this northern kingdom would never revolt again. It was just this complete mixture of people. And some of those are listed here. So the Samaritans were a mixture of many, many peoples. Some Jews who had intermarried with all these various groups listed. Now, the conflict over Jerusalem's temple was also central. And the original temple right here was Solomon's temple. It existed from 966 approximately to about 586 when Babylon conquered it in that year. And about 70 years later, after the conquering, around 516, with Persia's permission, now what had happened is Babylon had captured Judah and Jerusalem, that area, and then they were taken over by Persia. But Persia was a little different from some other kingdoms. They allowed their people to go back and not made them intermarry. They just go back as a group. And they allowed them to rebuild the temple. But the temple they rebuilt was nothing like Solomon's temple. And it says that many of the former priests who were alive during that time period, they saw it and actually wept. Okay? But the bottom line is they got to build a new temple. And many of them returned, although actually it was only like 10%. About 90% wanted to stay in Persia. They actually didn't even want to go back. Now in Ezra 4, verses 1 and 2, the Samaritans offered to help rebuild the temple. And this is very important here. They offered the Jews, the Samaritans, who were living in the northern part of Israel, I mentioned who they were now, and the response of them offering to help rebuild the temple was this: you have no part with us in building a house for our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. So in other words, no, you can't help. We're not letting you guys help, period. Now, obviously, that's going to be trouble. The rejection of the Samaritan assistance led to very big opposition and hostility. The Samaritans, feeling very spurned, obviously, actively sought to disrupt rebuilding efforts. So, in other words, they went the other direction. They set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to build. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, the king of Persia. He's the one who let the Jews come back. And down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right, now obviously this resulted in many, many delays of that temple being built. Eventually, under great opposition, the temple was finally completed. But you can imagine the opposition here. In the 5th century BC, the Samaritans adopted their own translation of the Torah, rejecting all other books of Scripture. Now, this is really important to understand. They only accepted the Torah, the first 5 books, as the Bible, and that's it. So all the rest of it, the writings and the prophets, no. The text of the Samaritan Torah is close to the text of the Jewish original, but this is going to be important. It has some doctrinal differences. One of the major ones was Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem was God's holy mountain, based on the fact it was here Joshua pronounced the blessings of the law. And this is going to be the central, one of the central ideas behind Jesus and the Samaritan woman and what she had to say about that. Even if there was once pure-blooded Jews among the Samaritans, they ceased to be so by intermarrying with the Gentiles, which was forbidden by the Torah. So here's another strike against them there. The Torah forbid that type of activity, the intermarrying. Now we're going back to Shechem on top of Mount Gerizim. And in 450 BC, a Samaritan king named Sanballat, actually that's a title, there was more than one Sanballat, but the first one, built a temple up here. And I mentioned why just previously, right on top of Mount Gerizim. Here are the ruins of it. I'm going to put a box around it right here. You can still see the ruins on Mount Gerizim today. Kind of an AI guess of what it might have looked like. We really don't know, but it probably was fairly impressive. These are some of the ruins today even. Okay, so now about 130 years before the birth of Jesus, the Jewish king of the Hasmonean dynasty, that's one of the dynasties of the Jews, John Hyrcanus I, conquered Samaria, destroyed their temple on this mountain. He was upset. Why did he do this? He was upset the Samaritans had previously refused to help the Jews fight the pagan Syrians when they came down to go after them and their temple. And they were led by this really evil leader named Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Samaritans refused to help. Well, you can probably guess why from all the previous things that had happened already. So there was very bad blood. So now they have just destroyed this temple. Now another incident of bad blood, as if we needed it. In 6 AD, some Samaritans, this would be the time period of Jesus, he would have been probably a younger boy or teen during that time period, crept into the Jerusalem temple and scattered human bones in it right before Passover, destroying the Passover celebration because they made the whole area unclean. It went against the Torah what they had done. They knew what they were doing. As a result of this and other disturbances, Pontius Pilate, the governor at that time period, ordered a massacre of Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. It just seems like it gets worse and worse and worse. One other video from the viewpoint of Mount Gerizim we're going to look at.
In the foreground, on the brown excavated hilltop, are the remains of a worship site on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. This place is referred to by the woman at the well, where Jesus announced his messiahship in the 4th chapter of John. Coming into view on the upper right is a large valley, and across the valley to the north is Mount Ebal. In between these two high hills is the modern city of Nablus, built near and over the ruins of ancient Shechem and Sychar. It was here that God promised Abraham, To your descendants I will give this land.
Now, here's a couple expressions that really demonstrate the incredible hatred between these two groups, the Jews and the Samaritans. It was forbidden to accept temple tax or any sin or guilt offerings from a Samaritan. Jews were never allowed to eat any unleavened bread prepared by a Samaritan or an animal killed by them. To enter the house of either a Samaritan or a Gentile would make a Jew ceremonially defiled. It is considered absolutely forbidden for a Jew to ever marry a Samaritan. Now, in the Jewish writings, I've got a record here, the Mishnah, which is one of the multiple writings of the Jews that are outside the Bible. It states, "He that eats the bread of Samaritans is like one that eats the flesh of swine. There are two nations that my soul detests, and the third is not a nation at all. The inhabitants of Mount Seir," okay, that'd be Petra, that'd be the Edomites, "and the Philistines, and the stupid people living at Shechem." And this statement that some of the Jews were challenging Jesus at the time, and look what they said to him. The Jews answered him, Jesus, "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon possessed?" Okay, these are Pharisees, some of the Pharisees trying to demean Jesus. Modern day Samaritans, surprisingly, they still exist. There's only maybe 800 of them left at this point, and most of them live right on Mount Gerizim or right next to it, on the slopes of it. These are some of the people in Mount Gerizim. They still practice the Passover. One of the elders of the group. Another couple pictures of the people. There's another group of Samaritans, probably about 500 on Mount Gerizim, and around 300 live in a little settlement around Tel Aviv. And this is a little bit older picture of a Passover ceremony of the Samaritans. So they actually exist even to this day. This was actually a Passover ceremony up on Mount Gerizim recently. And this, okay, which we're getting into next week, of course. Before Jerusalem became the capital location of the Holy Temple, even before Shiloh became the location of the tabernacle, Shechem, below here, was the religious center. What better location for Jesus to meet the Samaritan woman and outline his role in the covenant and salvation of the world? And there's so much background to the meeting here. Now, I know this is a little bit different because I was covering background and not really a teaching in the story. But I wanted to do that because getting into the next teachings here, the Samaritan woman and the Good Samaritan, so I didn't have to take time during those particular teachings. But next time we're going to go back to more of a traditional teaching, the woman at the well, kind of laying that foundation today for what we've already done here. And thank you for watching today. And my wish for you is shalom.